general release of ChatGPT and subsequently Google's Bard technologies. But in fact, we've been using artificial intelligence technologies to evolve our platform for some years now. So we're actually pretty optimistic that some of the most intractable problems that the education systems face around the world can be significantly improved with the use of AI technologies. And Andrea spoke to some of these, right? But I'll point to, for example, technology that will actually help bring about this holy grail of digital education since I've been involved for the last 20 years, which is enabling more personalized learning experiences for students, even in the absence of teachers. Not to replace the teachers necessarily, but what is a common problem around the world is a shortage of teachers. And picking up on what Andrea said, this is a problem that afflicts both rich and poor countries alike. There are not enough teachers in the world to solve the needs of growing populations around the world in particular. So artificial intelligence technologies, if they can deliver on the promise of personalized learning, can free up teachers to actually play a different role, so that we can ultimately kind of break I guess I'll call it an impediment of the kind of 1-to-30 ratio of one teacher for 30 students, and reimagine the role of a teacher in society so that maybe governments can think about addressing their gaps in education in a different way other than the factory assembly line approach that we've been doing for the last 150 years. So we're pretty optimistic. I know that doesn't sound like it, but we're pretty optimistic that AI technologies can make a big difference, and we think we're just at the beginning of it. I guess the flip side of that is that we have to do this responsibly. We have to do it carefully. I agree again with Andreas that there's potential ethical concerns, and some of the previous comments on the earlier sessions talked about concerns about how do we make sure that kids don't lose the ability to think critically. I myself have worried about the use of Bard to do common day tasks that I do every day, because I'm afraid that my brain is going to atrophy if I start relying upon Bard to write things for me. So I think these are valid concerns, and this is why at Google we're trying to take a kind of a slow, cautious approach to introducing these technologies. But let me pause there. I think this is what we see as the most exciting thing, and this is what I hear from talking to governments around the world. The very first questions that come up are, how does Google see the use of artificial intelligence technologies in an education system? And we could probably talk about it for hours, but let me stop there.
Thank you, William. And actually, you set up the opportunity to zoom in a little bit with the work that Drew's doing around personalized learning. And I know, Andreas, you had brought up the topic of tutoring and scaling that. So Drew, could you tell us a little bit about your work and how that feeds into this conversation?
Of course. Thank you, Elise. I'll start by saying that I agree with William that there's a lot of cause for hope here, despite the dire challenges we face in the education landscape. And of course, one of the opportunities is AI, but I think if we take one step back, we are still not leveraging the full benefits of the internet and the World Wide Web. And I believe 100 years from now, when we look back and we say, what was the year that the world truly became digital, and especially the education system? I don't think it's going to be the 90s. I think it's going to be 2020 with the pandemic. So many, schools went to one-on-one computers. We now have phones. This is just still being realized, all of that potential. And I mean, we see it. So I run an online tutoring platform, and we have students from 150 countries who are interacting with each other on Zoom. We have a student from China, a student from Colombia, a student from the US, all learning math together in the same Zoom room at the same time. That would not have been possible 5 years ago. People were not doing this in Skype. There is something different about the world getting online and connected. So I think that's the base level of technology that really still hasn't been fully realized, that potential. And now you add on this layer of AI. And as we talk about personalized learning, I think it's often easy to forget that personalized includes personal in the word. And I think there's many risks with AI and all these technologies, but the risk with the internet, the web, AI is that we lose track of the personal. There's a reason that we have mandatory public education, and it's not just about learning the material, it's about the social fabric of our countries. And I think that's the real risk we have with a lot of these technologies, is forgetting that. And especially when we think about these really powerful large language models and AI chatbots, there's so much potential there, and yet we still don't know how to incorporate it into the classroom. What's the role of the human? What's the role of the AI? How do they work together? It's also not surprising that we don't know how they work together yet, because we're 1 or 2 years into this revolution. I've seen a lot of promising examples. I think there's a lot of potential here, but I think there's a lot of experimentation. And so as we start to talk about the policy and regulatory side, I think we're very much in, the R&D innovation mode, where we need to make sure that we don't have these runaway risks with these AIs, but at the same time, we have to allow for, experimenting and innovating in the space with the emphasis on humans in the loop. And the best use I've seen of AI, and the ones we've been trying to experiment with, is when you can use the AI and the technology to further augment the human-to-human relationships, so that students, as William was mentioning, aren't in a classroom of 30 students all facing one direction, hearing a teacher talk, and the students only talking 5% of the day. The ideal would be students facing each other, talking amongst each other, spending over 50%, maybe 80% of their time talking with one another, with no screens in the room. So how can we use AI in ways, whether it's after school or, in more subtle ways in the classroom, to enable those types of interactions? And I don't have the answer, but I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to be really important to try to figure out how to use AI to further humanity.
Thank you all so much for sharing your insights here. So now turning the discussion a little bit towards sort of the governance of some of those challenges and issues, and especially the role of industry and government and government policy, and more particularly also where do human considerations such as human rights considerations come into play. I'd love to start off with you, Julie, especially on the last, but I think we'll start with industry. So what is the balance here? What is the role of industry? Where do we see government and especially how do we relate to human rights issues? William, Google, will you start us off?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll just pick up on something I forgot to mention, but I think it's a good segue, which is, I think, Drew's absolutely right that we have to make sure. Let me back up. I don't think that technology is the end. I think it is the means to the end, and I think this is I'm not the first person to say that. I read it even today in one of the OECD reports, Andreas. So, but what I do believe is that particularly with the advent of AI and the promise of these technologies, I think it's incumbent upon governments to ensure that learners, whether that be learners at home or learners in school, have access to the internet, because these technologies are cloud-centric, and they probably will be for the foreseeable future. We are doing a lot to try to bring the AI technologies down to the devices, but ultimately, I think internet connectivity is almost become a human right. So speaking of human rights, right? So I think the role of the government needs to be to lean into that and recognize that, and I don't really see any solution where there is equitable access to quality of education that doesn't involve access to internet. So I see these things as very much intertwined. Now, how do we collaborate with government, or how do we partner with government as industry, to try to make a difference, not only in regards to connectivity, but, the full spectrum of challenges in terms of digitizing education. I think, honestly, the construct that UNESCO has put forward, that we've been part of for the last year in shaping the Digital Transformation Collaborative, is a very good example. If you're not familiar with it, by all means, Google it. We're meeting on Saturday, the DTC group in New York, to kind of update on the status of things. But let me just tell you briefly what it's about. It's about 30 organizations, private sector included, you know, the leading technology companies, but also OECD and UNESCO and development agencies and other NGOs that have come together to try to support countries in the most need of support, bridging this technological gap. It's a big challenge, right? Because there's actually, you know, by some estimates, maybe $1 trillion that's required in order to bridge this gap of countries that don't have access to technology and education today to get to that point by 2030. So it's an insurmountable task, right? But there's a lot of optimism in the room because it might be the first time, at least in my career, where I've sat in the same room with direct competitors and tried to imagine how we can come up with solutions together. And working and talking very openly with governments, we've identified the first 3 countries that we're going to pilot this work together with. Those, I think it's public, are Brazil, Egypt, and South Africa, but there's already a growing list of countries that want to engage with us. So, you know, I think it's a great example of how private sector and government can collaborate to try to, you know, make a measurable and impactful difference. On the private sector side, I think, frankly, what we have to keep doing is we have to keep innovating. We don't have all the answers. We do try to be connected to our users, our customers, if you want to call them that, which are teachers and students, understand their use cases, but ultimately they're the ones that put the technology to use. And I think probably the thing that we could do a better job of, aside from innovating on the technology front, is you know, really making examples of the innovative practices that we see coming from the teacher community and making sure that others have access to that knowledge as well. So I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, William. So we are running a little bit out of time here, and I really love to hear your perspective, Julie, on also on the human rights angle and how we relate to that, and then perhaps we can manage sort of brief follow-up comments. Julie, would you care to comment?
Sure, I would love to. Before diving into the human rights, I just wanted to tag on to some of the things that was already mentioned and highlight a few opportunities that are coming down the pike over the next year. And I think part of that is what William just spoke about with the partnerships that are in place with UN and with UN member states, which is exactly what is needed. Specifically around technology, we are, you know, as soon as we are headed out of the next week and we have, you know, the SDG summit completed, people will start looking to next year, September, and the preparations for the Summit of the Future. And so this is another summit, high-level meeting that will be taking place in New York with all UN member states. And one of the big tasks ahead is to elaborate on a global digital compact. And I know that you've had the tech envoy speak, or we'll have him speak, so I'll leave the details to the experts. But there's just a huge opportunity to feed into this particular conversation that has so far been quite open. There are 2 member states that have been leading the process. They might be extended. There'll be online processes for everyone to feed in with what might be the best possible way to provide open, safe and accessible networks for everyone. So that's one in particular. I also just wanted to highlight that as part of this coming week, there are numerous high impact initiatives that is part of the UN's